Okay, we're going to finish up with Exodus chapter 2. We'll give them just a minute or two to find us here. We're going to be back in Exodus 2. Sherry says hello. Hello to Sherry. And Robin says hello. So that's right at a minute. So we'll go. I got those two. We'll go with it. Exodus chapter 2. We're going to go back and look at verses 16 through 22, then finish up the chapter, and then likely get into chapter 3 a little bit tonight. So Exodus chapter 2, beginning in verse 16. Always one more button to push. Exodus 2, beginning in verse 16. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. But when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, "Why have you come back so soon today?" And they said, "An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds. And what is more, he even drew the water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he then? Why is it that you have left the man behind? Invite him to have something to eat." Moses was willing to dwell with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses. And then she gave birth to a son, and he named him Gershom, for he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land, a stranger in a strange land." Okay. We talked a little bit last week about how this is reminiscent of the encounters of Abraham's servant and Jacob at wells, and that led to marriage. Particularly, I think Jacob, where Jacob kind of intervenes and actually gets sheep watered and everything, and but also the one with Abraham's servant. And then we have this image of Moses, and this was brought up, that he inserts himself into a controversy that is not something he actually probably has to get involved in, but chooses to do so. And this is now the second time he's done that, because that's what got him on the run from Egypt, was seeing an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he kills the Egyptian. So he has this kind of predisposition, I guess you could say, to get involved in controversies. He doesn't run from fights, he runs towards them. And maybe even when they're not his fights, he does this. So it's kind of I think a little bit of a resume for God in his choosing of Moses. This is a guy who will get involved, who will not back down, who will be willing to defend the oppressed, even though when we actually get to the calling of Moses, maybe that is not exactly the image that comes forward. Anyone else have any thoughts before we kind of keep talking about this some more? That's kind of what we talked about last week.
Well, he's kind of going to have to be that kind of a person to lead Israel. He's not going to be able to be, he's going to have to stand up and put up with it. But like you say, he tries not to do it, but I mean, once he's there, he's got to be that way, put up with that.
He's not a simple character, but he can't be one that is totally non-confrontational or totally afraid of conflict. So, yes, this is kind of, it's part of the story that points to Moses, why he's chosen, why he's the one called to lead Israel. He has this good background for it.
God knew what he was doing.
And, he saw Moses acting, and but there's this old saying that God does not call the qualified, he qualifies the called. So there's some of that too, that his reluctance is overcome. And we'll talk about that more in the next few weeks. But certainly this is a courageous act on Moses' part, and it's made a positive impression on his future father-in-law, who will play a big role really in helping Moses lead Israel later on. So anyone else have any thoughts on this passage before we kind of look at a little something different about it? Maybe you'll get me into that.
On the lighter side, the man says, well, where is he? You let a man like that get away, go back and get him.
I got 7 daughters to marry off, and it's the tradition of hospitality. We have, I think, some people in our culture today, and our congregation for that matter, who are probably more hospitable than I am by nature, and it's a commendable attribute. Our hospitality, though, is kind of our vision of what is hospitality, and how would we define that, and what would we expect someone who is being hospitable to us? What point is that their duty to hospitality met and maybe even exceeded? And it's a little bit different. We've talked about this. We talked about it in particular in connection with the story of Lot, that when you take someone into your home in this culture, when you extend hospitality to them, you are taking on responsibility for their care, for their well-being. And when we look at the story of Lot and we see his willingness to sacrifice his virgin daughters for the benefit of his house guests, it's a really, to us, that's just a repulsive story. It is a repulsive story, I think, in every way. It could be repulsive in a sense, but to consider him and to know that later on he's called Noble Lot, to see that, it's kind of hard for us to get our minds around a man who would do that to his daughters and think of him as being noble. We talked about it at the time, that this is a sign that Lot is willing to take the loss that these strangers that he has taken in might otherwise suffer, in a sense. By surrendering his daughters to these men, he is taking on the financial loss of being able to sell them into marriage. And so in their view, in that context, Lot is taking the hit. We don't see it that way, and I'm glad we don't see it that way, but that's kind of maybe how they saw it, at an extreme level of hospitality. Here, we also see this level of hospitality, and it is expected for the children, the daughters, to help the father keep that level of hospitality. They should have brought him with them, brought him back home. They should have invited him. So that's different. I mean, how many people in here want their kids inviting someone over for dinner?
Total stranger.
Even if they've helped you out. Mom, he patched my bicycle tire and aired it back up, and I was able to ride home. Here he is feeding, that. So it's a little bit different, isn't it? I mean, with this expectation for the daughters to initiate the hospitality. And, my grandparents lived in very rural part of Yell County, Arkansas, and it's more rural where they live. Not all of Yell County, but where they live is more rural today than it was then. There's fewer people living out in those woods than they were living then. But every so often, my grandfather would bring someone over for dinner, maybe someone passing through or whatever. He would bring them home for dinner without, of course, certainly not getting any permission from Grandma, and without even telling her. I mean, it's not like he could text her or anything and say, I'm bringing Joe Bob over for dinner or anything. And while Jethro or Reuel appears to be a fairly wealthy man, my grandparents were not particularly wealthy. So it was a real accommodation. And whoever they brought home better like cornbread and beans, because that's probably what they were having for dinner. And most folks back then did like cornbread and beans because that's what they were used to eating. But they might get a slab of tomato and a green onion to go with it if they're lucky. But it's the kind of thing that my grandfather would do. And I don't know how my grandmother felt about it. I have a pretty good idea of how my mom would have felt if my dad had done something like that. Just brought somebody home out of nowhere for dinner and not called and not told her ahead of time this is going to happen. And that's just that's one generation to the next. You know, how that expectation of what's realistic and what's possible and what should be happening in terms of hospitality could change. And I don't blame my mother for that. That's the new reality. There were no McDonald's anywhere near where my mother grew up. There's not any there now. There won't be any after we're gone. It's very remote. So it's a different world. It's one of these things where things change. And if you blessed someone, if you did someone a favor, they wanted the opportunity to repay you in some way. And sometimes it could be kind of competitive, who tops who on this sort of thing. But when we were living in Stillwater, Oklahoma, I was just a little kid. My dad had gone back to school to get his PhD, and he had a really good friend from Thailand. And they didn't have any kids, but they were such a really nice guy. I would go spend the night with them sometimes. And they took really good care of us. And I usually was not someone who wanted to be away from home, but they were so nice and they were so hospitable. It was fun to go stay with Prayong and Anya. And I was over there one time, and he had a neat little like tortoiseshell pocket knife. And I made the unforgivable mistake of saying, that is a very nice pocket knife. It's very pretty. The next thing I know, it's boxed up and being given to me as a gift, because in their culture, if you compliment them on something, they are expected to give it to you. So when you go over, it's really, in a sense, rude to compliment somebody. And I still have that knack, or it's not, and I don't want your stuff, but if I see something of yours that I, for some reason or other, think is really nice, or I'm just complimenting your acquisition. I have no idea or interest in how much you paid for it or how you got it or anything like that. I don't know if you got the 5-finger discount. I don't know if you inherited it. I don't know, and I don't care. I'm just saying, that's a nice pocket knife you got there or something like that. But that's, of course, when you're 7 or 8 years old, you can't get too mad at the kid about that. But I did a lot of other things my parents could get mad at me about, but I just thought it was a really neat pocket knife. And so I got it, and I have no idea where it's at, and I haven't known for a long time. So this culture, this expectation of hospitality is different from culture to culture, generation. Sometimes our generations change so quickly. And then, of course, sometimes now we come in contact with people that are very different culturally than we are. So it's something to think about. It is a calling for God's people to be hospitable, to be gracious, to be kind to the stranger. Jesus, he makes it very clear that you're supposed to be hospitable people. When you have a feast, don't invite all the great people in the town. Don't try to win favor and all that. Invite the poor and the blind and the sick and the infirm. Invite the people that really can never repay you. They can't bring you back to their house. So that's a different take on it than what's at stake here, because Moses is being repaid for his kindness to the daughters. And that's just one of the many ways Jesus changes everything and continually defies our expectations. But it's hospitality is supposed to be certainly a characteristic. I heard a story a long time ago, maybe beating this horse to death, I don't know, but it was a group of white American women. I think they were all military wives in Turkey, and they were traveling around somewhere, and they came to a little restaurant or business or something like that, and it was closed. The parents had to go somewhere, family deal, and had gone on, and they had left their 14-year-old boy there at home all by himself. And he served the ladies a very simple meal, some cheese, maybe some tea. Turkey, evidently, everywhere you go, they give you free tea, which is, that's a good idea. But, just a very simple snack, really, for these 4 wealthy American wives that were there. And they went on, and they didn't think anything about it, but they learned later on that what they had eaten was everything those parents had left for that boy to eat while they were gone. But that's the expectation, even in a teenage boy, that's the expectation of hospitality. You have strangers in your midst, you take care of them. It's a little glimpse into this culture, and I think an important one. And Moses is kind of a bridge on these cultures. He's in Midian, kind of the area between Egypt and the Promised Land. And he is kind of himself between Egypt and Israel. He is Hebrew genetically, completely Hebrew genetically, but being raised in the house of Pharaoh, you can't be more privileged and more Egyptian than that, really. In fact, that's how he is identified. An Egyptian did this for us. So just as Joseph's life, in a certain way, makes him a bridge between the Hebrew family of faith and Egypt, so too Moses is doing that. So too Moses' life puts him in that position where he's kind of a bridge. He's lived the life of an Egyptian, but he is still genetically Hebrew. So he's bridging these cultures. He's encountering a new culture, the Midianite culture, and marries into that culture. Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts on that before we move on? I think I've beaten the hospitality horse. It died a long time ago.
Walk like an Egyptian.
I don't know. I do not walk like an Egyptian.
No, Moses.
No, he refused. Okay, verses 23 through 25. Now it came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage. And they cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them.
Well, it's an interesting choice of words that God remembered his covenant. New American looks like it says he was mindful of his covenant, which I think fits better than, oh yeah, I got a covenant with these. He was mindful of that.
Well, it's kind of like the covenant with Noah. When Noah's floating around in the water, it says God remembered Noah. It's not like he forgot Noah. In the story, the whole world is covered with water. There's one family left floating around in a boat. Remembering doesn't mean being mindful in a sense. I know what you're saying, but in a sense, it's not like it's coming back to mind. Remembering means God has now chosen to act decisively, to intervene in the course of people's lives, whether it is to alleviate the floods so that Moses can, or excuse me, so that Noah can land his ark and get off the boat and start repopulating the planet, or if it is God looking down at the Hebrews and seeing their suffering and knowing that God has not made a promise specifically to these Hebrews. He hasn't appeared to them and made a promise, but he made a covenant with their ancestors, all three of them. He repeats the covenant. So he's really buying. And this is the great thing, in a sense, about our relationship with God. I talked about Sunday morning that God is not undefeated, that God suffers loss, and God loves through loss. And that's how we should love, not just because everything is wonderful, but because at times we have suffered loss and we continue to love. But his loss isn't reflective of his weakness. His loss is reflective of him binding himself to the weak. An infinite and all-powerful God binds himself as only he can to a finite and less than powerful and wise and gracious people. He ties himself to humanity with the covenant following Noah's experience, and then specifically to the family of faith with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He binds himself to these people, and that makes him vulnerable. That makes him a God that can be mocked at times. It's a relationship that makes people look at him and think he must not be that much of a God at times. Not because of anything he does or fails to do, but because of how his people live. And we're going to, as we get into chapter 3, at some point we'll talk a little bit about the name of God. God gives Noah a name in the second half of chapter 3. We probably won't get to that tonight. But God, his name, especially the one he gives to Moses in chapter 3, that is the sacred, holy name of God. And the Israelites considered it so sacred, at some point they stopped using it ever. One way to keep from taking the name of the Lord in vain is to never use it under any circumstances. And I think we see the dangers of going too far, going beyond what God has commanded. It has a downside too. But by giving people his name, what they do with it reflects on him. The way things work today may be a little bit different, but it wasn't that long ago that when a man and woman got married, it's kind of like automatically she took his name, she was him. She could automatically go down to the bank and get all of his money out of the bank if she wanted to. She could automatically go to the stores around town, and if he had an account there, charge on his account because she was his wife. Now, I don't think that works. First of all, a lot of businesses these days don't have their own accounts. You pay as you go, or one way or another. I guess you pay as you go. And you can't. I don't think most banks will let you run up a credit card or get into someone's account just because you're married to them anymore. But you used to be able to. That was this idea that once you're bound together in a marital covenant, you're the same person legally. There were some other problems we're not going to get into tonight with that arrangement too. But there's this oneness. And that means that what one person does reflects on the other one, impacts the other one. God has entered into such a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob for not just them personally, but for their family and for their descendants. And because he has entered into that covenant, he will move to the benefit, to the blessing of their descendants. He is compelled to do so by his own arrangement. So it's a very serious, something God took very seriously. He has given this family his name, not Yahweh, that he uses later on in chapter 3, but their name, Israel, El God, one who has striven with God, one who has fought with God, one who has fought alongside God. It's kind of hard to tell exactly what it means, but one who has contended with God. Whether that's just the wrestling, I've wrestled with God, or God has wrestled with me as I've gone out into the world. It's kind of both, really. He's given Israel his name. And he can't let another king dehumanize and oppress and exploit people that bear his name. He will not do it. Now, later on, that covenant relationship is very important throughout the history of Israel. And when they are not faithful to the covenant, God will deliver them back into captivity. And it is said, for his name's sake. Because they have dragged his name through the mud. They've made a laughing stock of him with the way they've lived. And then he will restore them again for his name's sake. So he disciplines them, then he restores them both for his name's sake. So this name, this is the beginning of all that. Not, I guess, the absolute beginning, but this is kind of according to the Mosaic law and this idea for Israel, what it means to be in this covenant relationship with God. Why did God rescue us from Egypt? The Exodus is never too far from the minds of the nation of Israel. It gives them hope in their suffering, but it also points them back even to the pre-Israel relationship, before Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, before he is Israel. God's care for them and concern for them. These are the ties God has for Israel. And it's so strong, and God is so powerful that he can see his people suffering at the hands of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen and probably would see for quite some time. And they're right in the middle of it, and they're suffering terribly. And God says, okay, I'm going to go get them out. And I'm going to do it. Not them, me. Because of the promises I made. Because they are my people. So coming out of this, again, you can see kind of the culture, some of the commandments, and beyond the commandment, the practices. Why they held the name of Israel, the name of God, so reverently. And why they might get to a point where they just don't say it at all because they don't want to do anything that would blaspheme it, anything that would denigrate it. It's too precious for that. But that's not really what God wants. He doesn't want us to never talk about him or mention his name. He wants us to bring glory and honor to his name. And I would suggest the way Israel lived, they did, because they bore his name the way they lived, they took his name in vain that way. We may not take his name in vain in our verbiage, specific verbiage, but do we take his name in vain if we say we are Christians and then treat people like we are not Christians, like we don't have any idea who Jesus was and how he lived and what he wanted his people to be like? Do we take his name in vain in that way? We pull up to somebody's house and with a Jesus fish on the back of a bumper sticker on the back of our car, maybe wearing a cross, and we go in and we act like we are the most godless person on the planet.
Or driving down the road with your little fish sticker on the car.
And driving like you're a godless person. Yeah. Are we not taking? I mean, that is, you may not have, I don't have it, and you may not think much of those bumper stickers or those emblems or whatever. That's fine. But when people wear those things, most of them are saying, I'm a Christian. They're declaring it to the world, whether it's true or not. I had a professor in my graduate program that, whenever they were trying to get a service person going through the yellow pages, if there was a Jesus fish in the ad for the business, they just went to the next business. Because their experience, and that person was a Christian, but their experience was with dealing with people with that, it was always a cop-out, it was always an excuse, and they never got good service from people that advertised a Christian-run business. That was like the worst experience they could hope for. They'd rather have a Wiccan come in and fix their plumbing or whatever. Because their plumbing actually got fixed. So those people, at least to that person, those people had taken the name of the Lord in vain. Made people run the other way. Even someone of faith running away from someone that ostensibly, at least, is their brother or sister in Christ because of how other people had that lived.
I know we'll talk about it later on, but Moses also had the opportunity to remind, if you will, God about his name. If you wipe these people out, what does that say about you? And so, yeah.
When Moses intervenes
right
on behalf of Israel, when he advocates for a sinful people with an angry God, puts himself in between them, just as Abraham did with the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. That is kind of the straw of last resort, is that for you to act vengefully is to besmirch your own name. This reflects poorly on you. And in Moses' case, they're going to say, you led them all out here in the middle of the wilderness just so you could kill them. And that's something, as we get into this discussion, the dialogue that's about to begin between Moses and God, we kind of have this image of God as being this authoritative leader, director, telling you exactly what to do, and you can like it or you can lump it, but buddy, you better do it, and that's it. God said it, I believed it, that settled it, that kind of thing. And yet we see in his back and forth with Moses the honoring and accommodation, really, of Moses' expressed concern. Even though those concerns might not have even been really valid, maybe they were just like little whiny excuses to get out of it. But God hears and God accommodates. We don't like to talk about a God who will accommodate because we want God to accommodate us, but we don't want God to accommodate anybody else. But God does hear, honor, and at times accommodate the concerns of humans. He responds. He is a responsive, listening God. If God did not listen, if he did not accommodate, why would we pray to him? I mean, he even accommodates Abraham in terms of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham, a real shrewd bargainer, he gets the deal down as far as he can, and then God cuts it off. No more deals. That's the number. And he didn't find them, evidently. But God interacts. God is connected to us. He is connected to his people. And he cares. Cast your cares on him because he cares for you. Why would you ask God to help you if you didn't think he loved you? If you didn't think he cared what happened to you? If we treated him just like we do our leaders today who make their decisions, they send forth an edict and you go to them and say, well, you said this, but, this is the problem it causes me. And what are they going to say? Lawyer up, tough, basically. Well, it depends on how much you gave to their campaign in the prior and maybe in the upcoming. That helps certainly. But our God doesn't just listen to the one he's calling to lead his nation out of the clutches of the Egyptian empire. He listens to the widow and the orphan and the stranger. Moses says, I'm a stranger in a strange land. He listens to the immigrant with no legal status who cries out to him, who is vulnerable because he's a traveler. Just as the angels who visited Lot were vulnerable as travelers. At least that's what the men thought of Sodom and Gomorrah thought. They thought they were vulnerable because they were just two men traveling alone. They didn't know that they weren't going to do anything to those guys that they didn't want to happen. So God hears Moses. And this is, and we get into this. This is like the beginning of a beautiful friendship. This is how the friendship starts, because ultimately God speaks to Moses as a man speaks to his friend. I read a journal article questioning whether or not normal people can be truly friends with God. Can we be that intimate and that close and powerful relationship with God the way Moses was? Because not everybody is God's friend in the Bible. But not everybody in the Bible had Jesus. And Jesus tells us we are his friends. And if we are the friends of Jesus, we are friends of the Father. And if Jesus invites us over, if he welcomes us, if he's prepared a place for us, the Father knows all about it, and the Father is all on board with it. Let's go ahead and we'll just read verses 1, I think, through, 6 of, 1 through 6 of chapter 3, just to give you something to think about for the week. This is next week, and we'll come back to chapter 3. I wanted to get into it. This really isn't doing anything, but we'll look at verses 1 through 6 real quick, and then we'll be dismissed in prayer. Something for you to think about for next week. Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said also, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Okay. This is the beginning, certainly, of the beautiful friendship. And it is going to be on God's terms. It's going to be on God's mountain. It's going to be more, really, in a sense, than Moses can bear. You know, people who present receiving a calling from God, being called to be part of God's kingdom and his people as a light and easy thing. Certainly, Jesus tells us his burden is light. You know, his yoke is easy. But it's also a very significant event in our lives. Moses can't keep going on the same path he was going on before and go into the presence of the Lord. He has to turn aside from where he's going to truly encounter God. We have to do that in our own lives. And sometimes, even as Christians, we have to turn aside from the path we have set for ourselves to encounter God. Okay. Thank you for your attention and comments. And at this time, Brother Ed will lead us in a closing prayer.